Let's get started. Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Vallejo. Welcome to science class. Today we'll be taking a look at estuaries. All righty. Now, what is an estuary? An estuary is a semi-enclosed area where fresh water and seawater meet and mix. So this happens at the ends of rivers as they empty it out into the ocean typically. And the tides are going in and out of this estuary region. Estuaries can be salt marshes, they can be mud flats, they could be a mangrove forest. They have many different looks, but what happens in an estuary is the same, whether it's a mangrove forest or a mud flat or salt marshes. What happens is there's a lot of changes in what we call the abiotic characteristics of the area, changes in salinity and temperature on a daily basis. Some animals are going to be exposed to the air for an extended period of time. And there are also soft sediments that are quite small and stuck together. Some biotic characteristics, some characteristics of living things that happen is that there's a low species diversity. That means that there's a smaller number of different species than we would see in, say, something like the coral reef or the tropical rainforest. But these are very productive regions. It says here they're typically high in biomass. And remember, biomass is the total mass of the living organism. So there's a lot of living things there. If not a lot of different living things, there's a lot of individual living things of those fewer species. So I have in this on this slide, we have a map showing you the estuary region at the end of the Mississippi River. You have the Barataria, Terrebonne estuary in Louisiana, which is most of this area here and very close to Baton Rouge there. And I used to live very close to an estuary. When I was growing up, I grew up in Salinas, California. That's about where those words are right there in this small inset picture. But that red point there is Elkhorn Slough in Central California, just off of Monterey Bay. So estuaries. All right, there are 4 different types of estuaries. The most common one is called the drowned river valley, and that's typical of rivers that dump into the ocean. But there are other types of estuaries: bar-built, tectonic, and fjords. Let's take a look at each of these on its own separate slide. Alrighty, so like I said, this is the most common type, the drowned river valley. And here's a large famous estuary region in Virginia, Maryland. This is the Chesapeake Bay. Lots of crabs in the Chesapeake Bay region. That's what it seems to be known for by many people. It says here, formed by the drowning of low land around the mouths of rivers when sea levels rose after the last ice age. The Chesapeake Bay is an example of a drowned river valley. Mississippi River and the estuary region in Louisiana, obviously one. The Elkhorn Slough is made from water coming from the Salinas River that comes up the middle of California and dumps into Monterey Bay. So different types of estuaries, but the most common type is the drowned river valley. Here's another one off of North Carolina, Alpha Cape Hatteras. These are called barrier islands. If you have a region like this, the area behind the barrier island, and here's the Chesapeake Bay that we saw in the previous slide, but the barrier islands are a little bit further down on this photo right there. There it is, Cape Hatteras right there. But North Carolina is known for their barrier islands. And then on the insides of the barrier islands between the island itself and the mainland. That's where you see these types of estuaries, these bar-built types of estuaries. I just live 2 hours south of San Francisco Bay, and there's many mud flats right here and salt marshes. These are called, these estuaries are called tectonic estuaries, formed as a result of land sinking due to movement of the Earth's crust. Obviously, it's San Francisco, famous for its earthquakes, but this region right here, not built up, but a lot of estuary, and you can see that when you drive up the freeway, the 680, as you go up the right side of the bay here. So this is the tectonic estuary, and by the way, the city of Vallejo is up here. So very exciting for me. And types of estuaries, again, this is the fourth type. These are fjords. See these in Norway. This is what you think of when you think of a fjord, or if you were to take an Alaskan cruise, you would see these also as really deep valleys on the coast as glaciers moved back from the ocean, and they cut through and make that U-shaped valley that you see right there. And then because of the snow melt coming down, and that's fresh water mixes with the salt water that's from the ocean, and then that area right there would be an estuary region. All right, now estuaries don't happen just anywhere, but as you can see here, I wrote best where the coastal plain is flat and the continental shelf is wide. That's why you don't see a lot of them between Elkhorn Slough and Santa Barbara on the California coast, because the mountains come right up to the sea, like in Big Sur, but and then underneath the ocean it drops off pretty quickly. Where would you see an estuary that has a wide shelf? More like Louisiana, you have a continental shelf that goes out into the ocean, and so it's flat and shallow for quite some time, off of both the Gulf side and the Atlantic side of the southern part of Florida, same kind of thing. So second bullet says not common in areas with steep, narrow continental shelves. So again, those are like I said, the rocky shores between Monterey, California and Santa Barbara, California. Lots of rocky shores. You'll find some tide pools there, and that area there off the coast of California is known as a marine protective region, and so a lot of animals have come back there. There's a kelp forest there, and we'll take a look at the kelp forest in a different talk, but the estuaries are not as common there as a little bit further north, Elkhorn Slough, San Francisco Bay, even going north, further north than that. Okay, all right. Now, the thing about the estuary regions is they change a lot in all kinds of abiotic conditions, like temperature, like exposure to the air. But a major factor is the salinity. And so right here you have a number 5 to 30 PSUs, and a PSU is a practical salinity unit. A practical salinity unit is equal to, if this is a percent, is a hundredth. Well, this is a thousandth right there. So it's 1 part in 1,000. It can also be expressed in grams per kilogram. So 5 to 30 is the salinity, which is lower than the average salinity of the ocean, which is about 35 plus. And so 35.6, 35.2. So the salinity in the estuary region is markedly less, and on the average, And it varies actually in the estuary region itself. And you can see on this graphic, you take a look at this little crab here. This crab right at this point in the deeper part of the estuary is in this darker blue, more salty water. And in the more shallow regions right here, this same crab is actually in a less salty area, and it's due to the depth of the water. So the depth of the water is important as far as where these guys live. And so the salinity is not going to be the same all throughout the estuary. It just depends on the mixing. And this is because the seawater is salty, and that makes it a little bit heavier than the fresh water. So this fresh water is going on top as it comes off of the continent, and the seawater is going under as it's coming from the ocean. And that's why this arrow's on the bottom and this arrow's on the top there. The water that is brought in right here, for obvious reasons from the picture, this is called the salt wedge. And so the salt water is coming in right there. All right, now organisms in the estuary are typically Eurohaline. Haline means salty, EU means good. And so it's a good thing these guys can tolerate a wide range of salinities. So, for many animals, most organisms in the estuary region, they can tolerate fluctuations in that salinity. It's not true for other organisms, but most of them, they can't tolerate a wide range. The other organisms, some are osmoregulators and some are osmoconformers. Now, an osmoregulator has an internal physiological structure that allows it to change to make the internal salinity of the organism match the external salinity, or the internal concentration of the body fluids would be equal to the outside. That's an osmoregulator. Now, osmoconformer have internal concentrations that vary with that of their surroundings. And so these organisms are going to be found in certain parts of the estuary, depending on the salinity of that particular region. Okay, so here's some examples of different animals. There's a salmon, which is an osmoregulator, and that's why the line is red. Same with this freshwater eel. Even though this is a freshwater organism, this is typically a saltwater organism. These guys have mechanisms to regulate their internal concentrations and keep them stable. And you can see they're pretty straight across right there, just like the perfect osmoregulator like that. Well, over here, this blue line for a polychaete. A polychaete is a worm that has these little legs on it. These are not legs. These are pseudopods that it uses for breathing. And so the polychaete worm actually is an osmoconformer. And so the concentration of fluids inside the polychaete hopefully match wherever it is. Because if the concentration is higher, then what's going to happen is that this worm will start to take up some water and start to bulge out. And if it's if this polychaete worm is in an area that is not as salty, then what's going to happen is the same thing. But if the polychaete is in an area that is too salty, then the water is going to be drawn out of the body of the polychaete. And so it needs to move back and forth and live in the areas of the estuary that have about the same concentration as the internal one. Now, the most interesting out of the four here is this crab. You can see the crab is an osmoconformer, but it also has some internal mechanisms that kick in. That's why it's a blue line, and then it's a red line. And then for salinity, for higher salinity, it has internal mechanisms to help it live in the environment right there. That is only for a certain range of salinity over here. You can see there's the blue line coming back, and that means that higher salinity, what happens is, again, an osmo conformer, and it hopefully will move back to this area over here. So that's how different animals will adapt to the different concentrations of salt in the estuary region. Right, not only animals, but plants deal with the changes in the salinity with the not by really behaviors, but they have physiological mechanisms. You can see that Spartina expels salts. It has a salt gland, and so that's a picture of some of those salt grasses right there. And then over here you have the pickleweed, and the pickleweed concentrates those solutes, which are the salts, in the tissues. Okay, so now, especially if it lives in a very salty area, it would take up more solutes, so that the internal and external concentrations are about the same. All right. Here's a slide about substrate. So there's mostly mud or sand as a result of low wave action or turbulence. Usually this is, and this is the reason for the smell in the estuary region. It says here in the second bullet, mud is difficult for animals to move through. Mud and sand also shift and like hard substrates, which is also a challenge. So you'll find clams inside the substrate, but clams move very slowly, and they have a muscular foot that comes out of the shell, and then they at the end of the foot is a knob, and then once the knob gets big, the clam pulls itself through the sand. And so clams move very slowly through the sand, and then you move that sand or mud out of the way. If you've ever been clamming, you're familiar with this. You got to dig up the sand or the mud in order to get the clams. It might be a foot down, but you dig and find it, then you got a treat right there. I was talking about the smell of the estuary, because the mud and the sand particles are much smaller than, say, rocks and pebbles, and so because of that, the air doesn't get in between like it would in typical soil and other environments. So because the oxygen doesn't get in, then you have it's kind of a sulfur kind of smell in a lot of estuaries, because of the chemical reactions that happened in the estuary, as you have what's called a anaerobic environment, and so there's no oxygen, so different bacteria try to extract energy from the areas, but they don't have oxygen, so you get that stinky smell. So there's sulfurous bacteria to do this, and that's why you get that smell in the estuary region. So remember, the estuary are areas where the water mixes from the ocean and the fresh water, and in the estuary regions you have different conditions, abiotic conditions, like the temperature that changes, the salinity that changes. Speaking of temperature, it says wide variation, especially a low tide, can be stressful for the animals, especially in the summer. Like the tide pools, many of these animals are going to be out of the water for an extended period of time. The change isn't as dramatic, but it can be, as the tides go in and out, that some of these guys are left, if not out of the water, they're still pretty high in the water table. and so that water is going to be a little bit warmer. And so that's going to be something that the animals are going to have to be adapted for. All right, with the estuary or estuarine communities, what happens is there's some organisms that go in and out from the estuary, from the ocean and go back. You probably know that salmon do this as they go back upstream. Many species of fish do this and spend some part of their life in the estuary region. As the adult fish go back over here and lay their eggs, then sometimes the larvae will stay in the estuary for some time before they move out to the ocean. Right. Plankton do this too. Remember, plankton is a term that means things that are floating around, not of their own accord, but go with the waves. And so those are typically smaller things and microscopic things. But it also includes things like fish and the planula of the jellyfish, the little larvae of jellyfish and their relatives. You know, there are many organisms that will spend a significant amount of time in the ocean and in the estuary. So these are called estuarine communities. Alrighty, I've got one of these. It's called a Secchi disk, and a Secchi disk is used to figure out what the turbidity or the cloudiness of a water sample is. And in the estuary region, the water is typically very, very cloudy. And that's because you have suspended sediments and particles from the rivers. The rivers are coming from the continent, so they typically have a lot of dirt, and theoretically, the rocks from the continent are being broken down, and those minerals and the rock, the dirt all comes down, and it causes the water from the rivers to be pretty cloudy, and then that mixes with the water from the ocean, so it makes the water not exactly transparent, but significantly cloudy. Second bullet says reduced clarity makes it more difficult for photosynthesis and autotrophs in the water. It's not just plants. Remember, half of the photosynthetic products, the oxygen and the air, come from microscopic green algae. And so in the estuary region, the phytoplankton are going to have a more difficult time going through photosynthesis. Thankfully, there are other plants that have adapted, higher plants that have adapted strategies to make the estuary and actually quite a significant environmental area as far as productivity. Speaking of productivity, the third bullet says most primary production is the result of flowering plants in the salt marsh as opposed to seaweeds or phytoplankton, and I guess that's what I was getting to. So phytoplankton I mentioned. I didn't mention the seaweeds. You're going to see that in the kelp forest talk, and it's not then the algae. And remember, phytoplankton are unicellular algae, and seaweeds are multicellular algae. They look like they're plants, but they're actually algae in the kingdom Protista. But your primary productivity in the estuary region is due to the higher plants that are there. Speaking of higher plants, here's an example. Here's the salt marshes, and the salt marshes have cordgrass in them. And so that is cordgrass right there. And you can find those all over the place. Very high primary production. And fish lay their eggs near here, and the baby fish will go in there and dart in and out. And it's a nursery for the young of many species of not just fish, but other organisms that live here. Let's see. Also, when organisms, whether plants or animals, die, what happens is that especially when the plants die, that contributes to the rotting part of the estuary, the detritus, the things that need to be decomposed, the dead plant parts. That's all in there. Okay, so those are salt marshes. Here's some mud flats, and some areas don't seem to have much going on, but if you look underneath the surface, you can see all different types of organisms. You can see many different worms here, different type of mollusks like mud snail and the moon snail, and a clam. So you have clams, you have mollusca, and different types of worms that live in the mudflat region. Okay, so this one right here, this is actually called the sandworm. It's an Euresis, and oftentimes when you're taking a marine biology class in a lab, you'll do a dissection of a sandworm as an example of an annelid, which is the group of segmented worms like the earthworm. Okay, here's the mangroves. Mangroves are actually not that common in the United States. They're only found in around Louisiana and Texas. The eastern part of Texas along the coast and parts of Florida have mangrove forests. These are usually found in much warmer areas, so tropical, subtropical areas. Mangroves have a high primary productivity. That means they are able to produce a lot of photosynthetic products that can be the basis of their ecosystem. Sorry, I've been talking too much today. And so species, also a species-rich community, more so than some of the other estuaries. So it says marine as well as terrestrial species tend to gather up in mangrove forests. The mangrove forests have trees whose roots stick out. Maybe it's on the next picture, you'll see it a little bit better. And another thing about mangroves is they protect the coast against wave action from storms. And so the dirt, the soil, the mud, the sand, has something it can hold on to, if you will, and then it doesn't get washed away as easily due to the waves. Here's the mangrove trees here. This is called the black mangrove, and you can see right here, this is typically seen off of Louisiana's coast, and even lately, the past 15, 20 years, where they weren't actually that common, but now they seem to be taking over this area and growing much taller. It used to be these trees would only be about, about 3-4 feet high, but now these guys can actually grow to about 9 meters. So 9 times that, so they can get much taller. So they're getting bigger and taking up more area in Louisiana and eastern Texas. So 9 feet. Oh, I wrote here, mangrove can grow up to 9 feet, typically found in tropical climates. So 9 feet, that's 3 meters compared to 1 meter right here. Okay, so mangroves, and here's another picture of a mangrove forest in Louisiana. Again, these guys are good at holding the sand and the mud in, and so these guys are useful in bringing the salt marshes back, and because they have that ability to trap the sediments. Also up here it says perhaps due to global warming, With fewer winters experiencing extended periods of freezing temperatures, the black mangrove has been expanding in South Louisiana for the past 20 years. So pretty interesting, the changes that we see in the world because of the average temperature increasing because of global warming. We have the mangrove forest coming back a little further north than you would. Like I said, they're common in Florida, but they weren't that common in Louisiana 20 years ago. But now they're picking up steam, and there's more mangrove forests, and these trees are actually bigger on average than they were before. Here's another photo of some mangrove forest, and what this shows is that these guys have little roots that are popping up, and these roots are called nematophores, and these nematophores are for gas exchange. And you can see them coming out. This is not in the water. They're coming out outside of the water. And so this way they can pick up some air because, you know, there's not any air in the soil. As we said before, the sand and the mud is too close together to allow the oxygen to get in. So up pop these nematophores, and these trees can breathe, if you will, through the through these nematophores, which come from the roots. So mangrove forests are a type of estuary. Here's a graphic that shows you food webs in the estuary ecosystem, but they're so complex. But over here you see that just as all food webs that we study, there are producers here, whether it's a salt marsh where you have cordgrass, whether you have you know, you have a river bottom. This is these are phytoplankton right here, and the seaweeds. Or if you have a mangrove forest, you have producers, and then these producers are able to take the light energy and through photosynthesis make products that are the basis of the ecosystems. And so we have other animals that eat those products, and then we have animals that eat those animals. Those are the carnivores in the food web. Right here in the middle, I need to point out that then you have, when everything dies, it turns into the detritus, and then there are bacteria that break the detritus back down, and then you have the loop of minerals that go through the circle of life, if you will, the food web. And so that is what's going on right there. No matter what type of estuary you have, there is a definite food web that is very complex. All right, here's another type of estuary specifically that we haven't got into yet. This is a dugong, like the manatee in Florida. But this one, I think, comes from Egypt. And it says here can be found in some estuaries if the water clarity permits. Remember that in the most common type of estuary where the rivers come down and mix, you're going to have a high turbidity in your water. If you look at the blue in the background, this is not as turbid, so that allows the light to come down and allows the seagrass to be successful. They need light in order to grow, and so then they become the producers of this sub-ecosystem of the estuary. And then finally, you have oyster reefs. Oyster reefs are found in many different estuaries as well. And these beds of oysters are like the coral in the coral reef, where other organisms start to live on the on the used shells of the oysters. Oysters are, as you probably know, they are univalves type of mollusk that has just one shell. And so when the oyster passes on, its shell still lives and will still exist, not lives, and then other organisms can live off of that. They can build on top of those oyster shells. In some cases, these may be the only hard substrates. Remember, substrate is things like whatever it grows on, whether it's a sand or the mud, or as you get closer to the tide pool areas, you might have a few rocks and more rocks as you get closer to the tide pools. So these are oyster reefs. Okay, so many different types of estuaries. Remember, an estuary is a region where salt water and fresh water mix, and you have different conditions that need to be dealt with, whether it's the changing salinity or the temperature or the drying out or the desiccation, all kinds of different environmental factors that animals and plants have to deal with in order to live successfully in the estuary. But the estuary is one of the most productive regions and very important for reproduction of many different marine organisms. That's why it's important to keep the estuaries around, to conserve the estuaries, and because they're right next to the ocean, often estuaries are turned into development projects for humans, and I mean, who wouldn't want to live right off of the ocean? You know, it's oceanfront property. So, in many parts of California, they just took an estuary region and paved it over and built condominiums on it, and so that happened more and more frequently from the 1970s onward. So that in California, there are very few estuary regions that remain. Alrighty, okay, so that's today's talk. That's estuaries, and I hope you got something good out of that. I'm Mr. Vallejo, and we will see you later.